Why don't we start out with the obvious? I'm going to move through the stuff pretty quickly, and then I'll leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. And honestly, feel free to ask me anything. If you don't want to ask as a group, come find me after. I'm happy to talk one-on-one. So why don't we start with what is dark data? Well, dark data is one of these things that permeates every facet of our lives, from housing to healthcare to our economy to our justice system. All these processes that we assume are based on evidence-based decision making. Sometimes that's true, and often it's not. We often make decisions in the absence of data, or through the misperception of data, or we make faulty inferences based on data. And so the way that I want you to think about dark data for the next few minutes is it's really any data that you should have access to. It should exist. You should be able to get at it. It should be parsable, but it isn't. Okay, page turn there. So I want to give you a few examples of the breadth of this definition. So roughly half of all births in Africa go unrecorded. Amazing statistic, unbelievable. Of that, a smaller percentage of that, a smaller percentage result in records of death. And of those records of death, we quite often don't get the cause of death. So again, that's data we just don't have access to. We have access to lots of public government data, as everybody in here should know. I know a lot of you guys work on government data sets, but there's data that isn't shared with us, sometimes to our detriment. The healthcare system generates a fair bit of data. We have access to just a fraction of that data. Again, I would say sometimes to our benefit, sometimes to our detriment. There's always going to be data that we do not have access to because it's proprietary, because there's strategic confidentiality, because somebody's making money off it. And as we all know, our justice system generates a tremendous amount of data. And unfortunately, data can still be withheld as part of those processes in the interest of prosecution. War casualties. So we are pretty good at counting our own dead, not so good with everybody else. Records management. We have digitized a lot of data, but there's still lots of data that has not been digitized, that lives as paper records. And in fact, there are NGOs around the world. This is their focus. They are frantically trying to ingest as much of this stuff as they possibly can before it goes away. Monolingualism. So right now, about 25% of the internet is English, which is a lot better than it was a decade ago when it was flipped around. It was about 75% English. Now it's 25. Still not great. There remains a lot of monolingual content out there that is just inaccessible to non-English speakers. News. There is data which is true and fairly sourced, and then there is data that is not. And if it is erroneous, accidentally erroneous, we call it misinformation. If it is deliberately erroneous, God forbid there would be any of that, we call it disinformation. Biodiversity, which is an area that we've done a fair bit of work in. We know of just over 1 million species on the planet. We suspect that there's probably 7.5 million that we don't know about. That is really a lowball estimate, and also declining. Shell corporations and tax havens, textbook definition of dark data, if for no other reason than it perpetuates inequalities and corruption. And then open source versus closed source software. 80 to 90% of businesses have open source software somewhere in their tech stack. Generally, it'll be layered below other proprietary code. So you might have a company that has an insurance app, but I guarantee they've got an open source mail server sitting under there somewhere. So hang on a sec here. In fact, there's a whole taxonomy of dark data out there underneath what we think of as our very data-rich 21st century world. And it's actually, I like this metaphor because it's actually a lot like dark matter in the sense that you can't see it, but you can infer that it's there by the influence that it has on what you can see. The point is that there shouldn't be dark data. That's not the message that I want you to walk away with. It would be nice to reduce some of it, but some types of dark data are necessary. So people should have an expectation of medical privacy. There should be, when you have competitive corporate data, so like certain types of financials, it's appropriate that that be confidential. Certain activities undertaken by the government, they should have a degree of latitude to operate in a covert capacity within certain limitations. Corporations need to be able to keep trade secrets. We're not suggesting that all of that should be out in the public eye. Content creators need some level of copyright protection, albeit hopefully with fair use provisions. And there are obviously legal use cases where privacy is paramount, especially involving minors. So where does dark data come from? In many cases, data starts out dark. So it is uncollected, like the biodiversity data that I was talking about earlier is a perfect example. There's a whole lot of data out there. We just haven't gone out and gotten it. Just haven't had the funding or the resources or whatever. We know it's there. We just haven't got it. However, it brightens as we make it a priority to ingest it. It is just as likely, though, that data becomes dark by being somehow encrypted or obfuscated, making it less accessible. And again, I'm not saying this isn't in and of itself a good or a bad thing, but it has good and bad impact. So it is good to be able to communicate among each other securely, to have an expectation of personal privacy, legal and financial protections, to have physical safety. You don't need to know where I am every minute of the day, and that is a good thing. However, when it moves over into illicit activities and ransomware, corruption, cronyism, and data that is siloed from one entity to another and can't be leveraged appropriately, that's when you run into problems. The point I'm really trying to make here is that these impacts are felt not just by governments, not just by corporations, they're felt by you and I every day. And so what I want to do is I want to very briefly take you through a few of the projects that we take on in the dark data space. And it'll give you an idea of really how this stuff applies on a day-to-day basis, certainly in the work that we do. Most of our work I can talk about pretty freely, but true to the nature of dark data, some of it I can't. We do a little bit of work with NGOs supporting vulnerable populations in conflict areas. And if we are red teaming on a project like that, you're not going to find that stuff on our website, and I'm not going to talk about it tonight. But if that is something that you're interested in and you want to talk one-on-one with me, then just reach out. Okay, as tough as it is, and it is really tough, as we heard a couple of weeks ago, we had a speaker talking about data relating to urban homelessness here in Toronto. As tough as it is to measure that, it is even tougher to measure rural homelessness. There are a couple of ways that you can do it. You can count secondary sources like food banks and other areas where people may transition, and you can do counts that way, or you can do statistical modeling. So you might have good data on a community over here of a certain size, and you can make certain statistical models about that community of that size, obviously with some margin of error. In this case, this was a project that we undertook with the Rural Development Network, which is in Alberta. They're doing really interesting work around trying to capture this sort of rural homelessness data such that they can then give this data to communities and they can go and get more funding for housing and hopefully alleviate the problem to a degree. Our goal with them was to take what they had already done with small-scale pilot efforts around modeling and identity safety and just try and scale it up and to try and make it not just a thing in Alberta, but ideally a thing across Canada and even potentially internationally. This was a really interesting project that we did earlier this year. So this may come as a surprise to you that there are actually two U.S. southern borders. There's the geographical border, which we're all familiar with, but there's also the information border, which extends well outside of the U.S. through surveillance technology and data sharing agreements that the U.S. has with other countries. And there's almost no public oversight of the privacy protocols that are employed here. Government agencies in the States will put out PIAs, privacy impact assessments, very, very low on detail. We do know that biometric data is being shared with other governments. And in Mexico, there are regions that are compromised by drug cartels. And so it's not a huge leap of the imagination to imagine that there's a huge risk of migrant populations being compromised by their data getting into the hands of people who should not have that data. potentially being intercepted, being extorted. Extortion is a big thing of migrant populations that are transiting Mexico and even being killed. So what we tried to accomplish with Temple University on this project through FOIAs and other means is really to kind of shine light on this problem, on the legal and the technical infrastructure that's in place that most people aren't aware is even there. I don't know if anybody is familiar with hate-based, show of hands. No, no one. Okay. Wow. Okay. That was a project that I co-founded about a decade ago. I'm actually glad that I got no show of hands there because I don't want to be known as a hate-based guy. But it was a lexicographic service for helping NGOs like the UN and the Red Cross and the European Union try and do better monitoring of hate speech, mainly in conflict areas. It was a precursor to a current platform that we've built called Weaponized Word. There's obviously, everybody knows here, there's a huge problem with online discriminatory content, whether it's hate speech, whether it's disinformation, threatening behavior. Every platform essentially tackles this problem alone, and a lot of them do a crap job of it. I don't think that's particularly revelatory. Weaponized Word was really built to fill a gap in tooling so that organizations can better automate this sort of detection. The reason you want to be able to automate it and automate it transparently is that you want as little of this stuff flowing in front of people who have to look at it, who have to see the same traumatizing crap day in and day out. So any sort of automation funnel that helps with that is arguably a good thing. I've talked a couple times already about biodiversity, but this is the project that I keep kind of pointing at in my head. We did a project with the Biological Survey of Canada. Again, I don't know if anybody in here is familiar with them, doing really good work here in Canada. This was a project to try to get at some of the data that already exists, but which is locked away inside academic papers, paywalled journals, which are insanely expensive. And even if you can get to that data, is not necessarily in an easily parsed or structured format such that you can do much with it without a lot of transformation. So our goal was to bring as much of that data as possible out as structured data sets that other organizations could use. Okay, now OMX, this was an interesting one. It's actually a project that preceded the Dark Data project, but it so fits our mandate that I kind of have to mention it here. There's a really interesting kind of transaction that governments around the world indulge in when they want to buy something that is not built in their local economy. So you are the government of Canada, and let's say you want to buy a big radar system to patrol the Arctic, so we don't have any, ICBMs coming over the Arctic Circle. We don't make big radar systems in Canada. So what do? Well, you go to a French company like Thales, or some U.S. company, European company, whatever, and you say, listen, here's billions of dollars for this, whatever it is, icebreaker, what have you. But there's one condition. You got to spend that same money in our economy over the next X number of years, and a certain percentage in women-owned businesses, a certain percentage in minority-owned businesses. For God's sakes, a certain percentage in the Atlantic provinces where the fisheries industry is devastated and the mining industry is devastated. And this is called counter trade. The reason that you probably haven't heard about it, I'm willing to bet that you haven't heard about it, is that it is mainly handled with like stubby pencils and fax machines. And it has been, because of that, so that complete lack of transparency has resulted in a lot of, you guessed it, corruption. And so there are countless stories of, there was a notorious case a few years ago in, oh my God, was it Portugal? I don't want to malign any country because I may have the wrong country, but there was a country that did a submarine deal that was just, went to the cousin of the prime minister or something like that. Anyways, our goal with OMX was to make this into a digital process and make it a much more transparent process so that we can actually see these money flows as they're coming back into domestic economies and hopefully going towards the people who really need them. When we buy something big, let's get something else in terms of the growth of our own economy. Okay. I know I'm running up on the clock here, so I'm going to go, this is the last section, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. One of the things that I hope you've noticed is that the stuff that we do is a whole lot like the stuff that you guys talk about every week. These are very similar projects. And And so what I'd like to do, hoping it's of some value to the folks here, is I want to share some of what we have learned from doing this kind of stuff, because these all now really constitute criteria that help us decide whether or not we take on a given project. No matter how much time, I don't think anybody here probably has reams and reams of free time. Maybe you do. I don't. No matter how much free time you have, you can't do everything. So at some point, you've got to make a decision. You've got to make a triage decision about what problem am I going to try and solve and what problem am I going to have to wait on. And so these are rules for us that help us make those kinds of decisions. So number one, right off the bat, is there a plan? So if you work in an organization as part of a team, or not in an organization as part of a team, but trying to tackle some sort of problem, you're going to do some level of planning. And for-profit organizations, they'll do road mapping, they'll do technical specifications, functional specifications. If you're a nonprofit, you're probably doing a different class of documentation. Maybe you're doing concept notes or logic models because your funders are asking you to do this. You may have heard that if you practice agile methodology, you don't have to do any paperwork at all. That's actually not how agile works. The idea is to go lean, not to go blind. We always do a fair bit of planning. It's not that we love documentation, but we do a fair bit of planning because there's certain things that I think you need to know to make those triaging decisions. What are the actual quantifiable outputs? Are you helping people? How are you helping people? What happens after the fun part of building a project is done? Have you thought through the safety protocols? These are all really critical things that it's good to know before you get into something as opposed to midway through. Number two, does it have an impact on end beneficiaries? So a lot of humanitarian-focused organizations are masters of analysis. They spend a lot of time writing reports, and in all fairness, some of those reports can be pretty insightful. But it's really not what we do. We are not in the awareness building business. We build things. We build products. We build teams. We build workflows. We're also, frankly, not big on advocacy or partisanship. I'm a dual Canadian-American citizen. I have some thoughts on the upcoming US election and the existential nature thereof, but I will not take on political work because that's not what this is supposed to be about. If you are taking on political work or partisan work, there's always a risk that you're going to be tempted to skew the story. I mentioned here as well working with bad actors. On the one hand, I get why you might not want to do business with Facebook. You might not want to do business with governments who do things that you don't approve of. But if you do that, I would question who you're really hurting. And I don't think you're hurting the people at the top. I think you're hurting the people at the bottom. Our policy is we'll talk to just about anyone who does just about anything, just to have a dialogue, just if there's a chance that we can move the needle. So the common theme of all of this stuff is the idea of impact. If you're going to try and solve a problem, make sure the problem you're solving is for end beneficiaries, and don't get too distracted by all the entities between you and them. Number three, are the impacts measurable? It's great that you've defined some end impacts, but if they're qualitative, I would argue that you don't really know if you're making a difference. For-profit organizations, you've got your profit and loss, your user traction, you're measuring eyeballs. Nonprofits generally don't measure things this way. So we make sure that every project starts with a plan for what we want to measure, how we want to measure it, and specifically what thresholds we want to hit. If we cannot define actual measurables, it's probably an indication that we haven't thought about the project carefully enough, and we'll pump on the brakes until we do know what we can measure. So I've listed a couple examples here that you might consider measurables: number of beds occupied, number of meals served, number of patients who run through an intake process, number of patients who go from paper transitioning to online transition. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you have some measurables. Number four, is it sustainable? So I don't mean, is it good for the environment, which is obviously important. What I mean is, who pays for it? Does it rely on short-term grants from government or foundations? Does it require a donor base? We do not take grant or donor money as a bit of a point of principle because we see those as inherently perishable revenue streams. But you do need some cash to be able to keep things running. Hardware has to be maintained. Software needs to be patched. Websites need to be hosted. So you do need to think in terms of how you're going to fund that stuff. And even if your role is just labor, you need to think about what happens when you move on. When you're done with this project, you're probably not going to be running this project for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So if you want it to outlive you, what does that look like? What is that plan? And then 5, and finally, I am wrapping up here. Is it safe? Which is, I should have put it in quotes so that everybody would know it was a Marathon Man reference. It is not uncommon, I said here, for good projects to have negative outcomes. Back in 2019, the Red Cross got breached. Sensitive data was disclosed on refugees who had their data in the system, including minors. The UN has also taken some heat over the last few years for capturing biometrics as part of their efforts to fairly distribute aid. Whereas I would argue, and I think a lot of other people would argue, that hoarding and profiteering are perhaps lesser risks than biometric breaches and disclosures. But the point is that you should really be taking a security-first approach to whatever you do if you're handling sensitive data, and especially if you're working with vulnerable populations who may not have awareness or agency over the data that you're working with. We have an 8-point operational security protocol we follow. I won't waste time going through all of it. It's all pretty common sense stuff that you want to collect as little data as possible. Keep as little access to that data as possible. Depermission people who don't need it. Passwords. Lock down your hardware. Be aware of security and privacy legislation in whichever areas you operate in. If you are building something that is meant to be used in Europe, you have a very different set of problems than if you're building something that's going to be used in Canada, the United States. Just the privacy legislation is different, and you have to be able to accommodate that. We are big advocates of a tiered approach to PII, which we call anthro encryption. And the goal is to choose the lowest possible level of retention for your use case. The absolute lowest, the absolute best level is don't collect it. If you don't need that data, don't collect it. Don't collect data thinking that you might need it in the future. If you absolutely have to collect it, the next layer is, well, then aggregate it. You can do attributable aggregation, which means that you aggregate it and then you secretly store the source data behind lock and key in case you ever need it. This is how election data is captured. Or you can do destructive aggregation. So you aggregate it and then nuke the source data. If you got to go further than that and you have to encrypt data, start with one-way encryption if you possibly can. Every time you put in a password on a website, in theory, it's being one-way encrypted. In actual fact, if you're watching the news, about a week ago, there was a big thing about how Facebook Ireland was keeping passwords, huge amounts of passwords, in plain text, for the love of God. So don't do that. The thing about hashing is that you can hash anything. So I'm talking about passwords, but biometrics. So if your iris, you can hash that, for the love of God. There's no need for there to be an image of your iris in anybody's database anywhere. Capture the data, hash it, get rid of the source data. If you absolutely have to be able to decrypt, the only advice I'd offer is don't use a crap algorithm like MD5. And then finally, the last one I have on here is deniable encryption. I don't know if anybody has played it all around with deniable encryption, but the idea is that when you encrypt something, the one downside of encrypting something is that it looks encrypted. If you can encrypt something that looks like plain text when it comes out the other end, you're in good shape. That's it. I'm going to stop there. Thanks for bearing with me. I know I went over. My hope is that some of this was of use to the folks in this room. And really, I would like everybody to consider me, put me on your speed dial. If I can help at any point with any projects you're working on, if any of this is relevant, please do reach out. I'm on friggin' everything. I should do another slide just with every bloody social network I'm on. So you can find me anywhere, but do not follow me in my neighborhood.
Thank you.